Boa tarde a todos, todas.
Good afternoon, everybody. I would like to thank you, everyone that is following us since yesterday and will be with us until the end of the day. I hope that you are enjoying our encounters for our meetings. For those who are going to watch later, welcome our speakers, our great. Thank you. I would like to thank you, the sign language translators that will follow us until the end of this encounter. I'm Luciana Rendeiro. I'm an educator, researcher for more than 10 years and a part of the Black Women Forum about education. Nowadays, I work at SETA Project system, educational system for anti-racist education, and I'm part of the educational department. We are starting now our last roundtable of the course, Inclusion and Anti-Racist Education at Seminar SETA. Our guests now are Luciana Viegas, Ingrid and Anelise. I also like to say that this event is done with the Discourse Research Group of the Rural University of Rio de Janeiro. We would like to thank you. More than 200 people enrolled to be part of this process. I start this conversation with my description, and I request the speaker, the presenters to describe themselves. So I'm a Black woman. I have curly hair. They are the size of, they go up to my shoulder. I'm wearing a white and gold dress with red glasses. Behind me, there's white curtains with white walls. Now I'm going to present our guests. Luciana Viegas is autistic. She is a Black woman, and she's the mother of an autistic kid. She's graduated in pedagogy, and she works since 2014 with this. In 2020, she decided to create a Black and autistic woman, a Black and autistic mother speaking, to tell people her experiences with included with this inclusion, and also about education with the human rights of people with disabilities, and also to she's one of the movements of Black lives with disabilities matter in Brazil. So please present yourself and describe yourself. Good afternoon, I think almost good evening. My name is Luciana Viegas. I will present myself, and then we can talk. I'm a Black woman. I have dreadlocks up to my shoulder. I'm wearing glasses. I'm wearing a pink tank top, and I'm at my room, but you can't see it because it's my kids' room. So actually, it's a little bit messy. So I didn't focus on the entire screen. For now, it's an honor to be here. Actually, thank you for SETA Project for inviting me to be part of this amazing team and to talk about inclusive education. Now we passed the mic to Ingrid and Anelise. She has a she has a degree in pedagogy with the special education by the Unesp, the Paulista University. She has a master's degree in education, a doctorate degree uh, in this post-graduation program in the University of São Paulo. And nowadays, she works at the Federal Institute of São Paulo, researcher of Carlos Chagas Foundation, and member of the research group CNTQ, the special education policies. She develops researches in the area of education, focusing in educational trajectory and students with disabilities, with this intersection between race, color, and gender. Welcome, Ingrid. Please describe yourself. Thank you. Good evening. I'm a Black woman. I'm using blue glasses. I'm wearing a pink lipstick. I have a yellow T-shirt. I have my hair. It's up, and behind me there is a white wall with a blue and yellow board. It's an honor to be part of this project. I'm very pleased to be here, and it's very innovative to be part of a project that it's anti-racist, and at the same time, it's going to enable everyone to be part of education. Thank you. We are happy to have you here. Thank you once more for being here. I'm going to highlight that Ingrid and Luciana, they are our accessibility consultants, and they are helping us to think about inclusion as a separate part of the project. So all the activities and actions of SETA Project, they think about accessibility in all the different access, advocacy, partnership to produce our textbooks, research. So Ingrid and Luciana are helping us. They are our consultants. So in this way, I think it would be interesting to start qualifying the debate about inclusive education, social inclusion, accessibility, and African racial perspective. So for us to start our conversation, I would like you to talk about the concepts of accessibility, social inclusion, and how they are connected. And when we talk about inclusive education, we are talking about these two concepts, or is a completely different debate. I'm not sure who wants to start, so feel free, you decide. Ingrid, go ahead, you can start, and then we follow. Otherwise, I'll be lost here. So, no, it's okay. We can both speak, so I can start. Well, I think in the first part of the issue is to think about the inclusion, even though historically inside education, it's seen as a perspective for the person with disabilities, for people with disabilities specifically, it's put it in a broader perspective when we're talking about educational scholar inclusion. We are talking about all the groups that were left behind in education, not only people with disabilities. So this debate for those who have disabilities is a connection with the special education, that it's what is going to focus in this education and people with disabilities in Brazil. So I think it is important to have these differences, because many times we talk about special education and inclusive education as they were the same. So special education, it's inside this inclusive education. It's a part of it. So when we think about social inclusion, we are talking about all those groups that were historically left behind in education, not only with people with those disabilities, as I said. Like this, we have to think that social inclusion is going to be connected to accessibility and education. So we are talking basically about a process that will include both concepts. How can we guarantee the social inclusion? We need accessibility. And accessibility, we have been talking, amplifying this scope that is not only a sector of this special education. Usually we hear that accessibility for students with disability are able to access content and spaces and many other aspects that are involved in education. But we also have been thinking that without these affirmative policies, we cannot guarantee accessibility for a part of the Black population in Brazil. So we understand that this quota shares is a process for a certain group. So when we talk about the social inclusion, schooling and accessibility is always trying to find in this broader scope how they relate themselves, and also having accessibility also always as a process and not a methodology. In a way that talking about accessibility is to associate it to all the parts and different processes. Can be a process of a project at SETA, a teaching project. It can be a process of a specific learning process of a specific institution. So we have to think not only as a resource, but as something that we are going to offer for those who want to think about in the education. So if we put as a resource or even a learning process to look at this, always having as a reference a different material that is going to talk about accessibility, we are risking to leave accessibility. So for those who want to choose it, people that feel that they are interested or involved with this debate. So so not to be separate debate or a choice, accessibility needs to be part in a transversal way to the entire educational process, the entire social inclusion process. So in my point of view, I think that they are connected. If we're talking about an inclusive education and anti-racist education, we cannot thinking about inclusive that it's racist or sexist or homophobic. So to be inclusive, everyone needs to be part of it. So we need to have the meanings to get to reach this accessibility, because in this process a lot of people stop accessing education and are still not being able to access education. So this is how I understand, but I would like to hear from Luciana as someone that is living accessibility in a whole different way. Well, everything everything that Ingrid said, it's the same with us, not only as people with disability, but as a movement. I think that I have been working nonstop for these years, and we need accessibility in a broader way. The word is already says that, and we are saying before coming here about these dynamics that maybe when we talk about uh, people with disabilities and when we talk about education of those people with disabilities, I think that it's a whole different word, because historically we were silent and we were erased, and we are not the main characters of this story. How people with disabilities we never stopped to think how they lived in the other years, in the previous years, in the other centuries. So we just remember that we have violent stories against bodies with disabilities. And when we talk about accessibility, is a dynamic that is bringing an idea of a different look, because it's talking about bodies, it's talking about limitations in different ways. And when we will deal this as a doctor would deal with it, and we take this to different sectors of science, can be in education, in the social field. So it's always something, it's never a social part. So, and throughout story, we had to be able to explain basic things. People with disabilities are people, and it seems that we are saying that people with disabilities exist. They can have voices, that we need to talk about its needs. Everything, the concept that we have about autonomy, it's a concept that it's completely wrong about this autonomy, that we think that should be autonomous, the person cannot should not depend on anyone. That is the wrong concept for those who don't have any type of disabilities. It's impossible for you to go through this life for 30, 40, 50 years without counting on anyone, without not needing any type of support. I think that this is an important point. And what it was said, we would talk about disability and inclusion in this methodology box. So we have methods that we were able to create here to include people with disabilities at the states. But these methods, they don't think about the limitations, because there's diversity, that is the disability, and then they don't understand this, that there's no possible method. And we're talking about the educators that will affirm this, because there's no method that it's good for all human beings. And in this, disability is the same. So we have to understand the need with an open mind and in a dynamic way. And then we go back and we understand that inclusion, it goes beyond these public policies, and is also part of this political effectuation. And we talked about this thing that it's bring to us. Those who are bringing are able to tell us that we also need to be responsible and foster something of some relations goes through inclusion. If those who are want to include, it's the educator. It can be in a relationship or friendship. If they don't want to feed them and adapt, and they don't want to include, it doesn't matter how they are going to do that. We don't have this debate. The inclusion debate and accessibility will be limited to methods.
Well, mainly in school that doesn't have this kind of awareness, and it was not created for Black people or for diverse people. Then the schools propose a method, believing they can deal with that, but they can't, obviously. So they focus on the method, forget the quality, and then we have very important disabilities being taken. I think that you brought a very interesting context, because we need to bring that to education, mainly when we think about anti-racist education. You were mentioning social inclusion and thinking about the social in a more comprehensive way. And it's interesting when Luciana talks about the accessibility of a more open perspective, this concept of the political affection. And this is what we think when we think about anti-racism. We think about the many contexts of welcoming not only physically the person, but also the structure and regular welcoming, and now taking that to the ethnico-racial relations. When we think an anti-racist education, and I know you mentioned in your first speech that, but I would like to open more this dialogue. So how accessibility work can happen to social inclusion? I mean, how can a school that wants to be anti-racist can, in their daily life, qualify and implement accessibility practices in these cases? I'm talking in such a way that we can understand that we have professors, teachers here, educators. So I think it's interesting that we also open a little bit to this understanding. Well, I think that is not part of the process of this anti-racist school. This is the first point we need to consider. And I'll repeat that forever, because unfortunately, we, even as disabled people and researchers in the area, we treat inclusion as something aside from the process. And when we talk about inclusion, and Ingrid mentioned that, we are talking about inclusion of disabled people. But if we spread this concept and go to inclusion, in fact, we see that it can happen to disabled people, but it can also happen to Black people. It is the same system. There is no how to treat in a different way. So I think this is the first point. It is how to make anti-racist schools more inclusive. No, how can my anti-racist school, how can it work being anti-racist to be inclusive? So instead of doing this movement, we do it backwards. We cannot have an inclusive school, an anti-racist school, if it is not included. It can't happen. It's inherent. There is no way of working. The school won't be anti-racist if they don't think about inclusion. So for sure, it won't ever be anti-racist. So this is what I deal the most in inclusion, and I talk to teachers about it. And how can make my classes, and I received this question a lot, how can I make my classes better and more accessible, more inclusive? Well, I tell you that your class is not good. If it's not inclusive, it's not good. There is no possibility of being successful in your teaching process if you don't include whatever is the barrier you have for this learning. So identifying and bring it in a more practical and pragmatic way to identify the barriers to learning is the first point. This barrier can be by a disability, but in also in other forms, like, for example, a hungry kid that cannot learn, and half of the people starving in Brazil are Black people. So if you have an inclusive school, automatically this school is anti-racist. It cannot be anti-racist if it's not inclusive. So this is a point, a food for thought. So we need to subvert the concept about inclusion, because in fact inclusion goes mainly through race, and bringing some data here. Why does it happen? Because we are the majority of the population. Most of it is Black and brown people, and the majority of the population, I mean, 1/4 of the population is of disabled people in this general population. So mathematics, logics talk to me that if I have the majority of the Brazilian population of Black and brown people and 1/4 of the whole population of disabled people, obviously we have a people, a big number of disabled Black people
dos espaços de
and that are
acesso.
not taking the spaces to have access to education, just like the Black population in general. Is it institutionalized? No. I was reading this afternoon about it. In the institutions, the so-called care institutions for disabled people. So the person arrived there at age 6 and they spend their lives there. They never leave. And most of the bodies in this case are Black bodies. So this is a process that we need to revert. If we give access to Black people, automatically we need to understand that we need to give access to Black disabled people, understanding that in a more comprehensive way with accessibility and inclusion. So now having a dialogue with Lu, thinking about anti-racist education and inclusive education demands us to have anti-racism or inclusion as qualifiers. So an inclusive, anti-racist, anti-sexistic, whatever education, so that we have less risk that the idea of inclusion and accessibility are aside from what is or what are the proposals of education trying to overcome oppression. So if we understand that capacitism is a way of oppressing, it will always be a common after other qualification against any way of oppression. So they are always walking hand in hand. They walk together all the time. It's impossible to think about anti-capacitist education without thinking about anti-racism. Also, as Lu mentioned, data show that majority of the Black population, Black and brown population, classified as disabled people are, okay, I'm sorry, most of the people, disabled people, are qualified as Black and brown people, and vice versa. And why am I saying that? Because the classification of disability is not objective. To some disabilities, we can find objectivity, like we can find tools and metrics to tell about visual acuity or hearing acuity, but the population of the mentally disabled people that is the majority in schools, and this is an interesting movement. So the population with mental disability in Brazil is the majority. And in school, it inverts more than half of the whole population of disabled students. They have intellectual disability because the school is the one to qualify or to indicate that, although we still have clinical determination to talk about intellectual disability or not, and doctors should do that, but generally this is the school who starts showing that the person has an issue that can be understood as intellectual disability. So it's not by chance that the majority of the students with intellectual disability being Black students. There is a correlation between being a student, according to the qualification of the school, as capable of adequating to learning and behaving, with the look that the general population and the stigma about what is the Black person and the disabled person. So there is a cross link in it. So looking at a Black boy with difficulties to learn how to write and read gives more chances for them to be indicated with intellectual disability than a non-Black boy. Currently, a non-Black boy can be sent not to special education, but they go to services that are less stigmatized, like a psychopedagogist or occupational therapy, but not in the scope that puts the person in a negative way when they understand the disability as a negative aspect. So this relation between anti-racist school and anti-capacitist school will always happen. When we hear about an anti-racist school, we are talking about an anti-capacitist school, and the inverse is also true. And thinking about the practices, about what she said, thinking about accessibility, we think in a very contextualized way. What are the barriers, the subjects, and what we have to offer? The fact of a school not having a translator and interpret can be considered a non-inclusive, non-accessible school. Well, we have a concept called accessibility that is basically saying talk about the accessibility we have available. So what we have at this moment to ensure that everyone participates. Some will have more access, others less, due to the conditions of the environment and not the conditions of people. Because if we were all deaf here, for example, the sign language interpreter wouldn't be different. So that's why we need to give a context to all that. Not having this professional at school, what do we do if a kid can't hear? What can we offer? What we have as resources when we have asked this question? We locate the reasonable accessibilities because we'll search according to what the school hears. He can't hear what I say. What if he illustrates? If he reads? And what about having some caption, subtitles? If I can't have it automatically, what about people typing on online activities, the text that is being said? So we can find resources according to the context. So when we talk about an anti-racist and anti-capacitist school with accessibility, is to think about accessibility as one of the principles of the school that will always acknowledge what are the limitations, what they don't have to offer to the subject. The fact of identifying what can't be offered puts us in a political environment of considering that something is missing, and it may generate another political movement of searching for what is missing. Where can I locate an interpreter, for example? It is in the city legislation. Do we have this professional in the body of professionals in the network? So if it's not there, how can we hire? Who are these people? Where they are? So when we think about inclusive education and anti-racist education and accessibility, we start searching for the tools for that context and what it puts as a necessary tool. So a student can see, has no, and I have no ability of having an audio description, considering the whole methodology to do that. So what can I offer in this sense to my student? I don't have a language, a printer or a 3D printer to have an object for some class, but I'm considering that if I don't have it, I can consider if it's necessary or not. If I consider that it's not necessary, to search for means for that. So that's why thinking about accessibility as a qualifier of education puts us in this movement of understanding the process, thinking since the beginning of school as a project, a political pedagogic project, and also what we have in the daily lives of the students. So as it was said, we can create, for example, a manual to indicate if the system is accessible or not, because it depends on the context. We have teaching networks, for example, with a sign language interpreters to be hired, but they are not hired. So if I don't question that, I don't reach the professional. So if I look at the documentation, I'll say the school is accessible because there is the professional. I would say yes, but what is the status of the professional at school? Probably the profession is not there. So not necessarily the resources available or unavailable are the ones who will say if the school is accessible or not. There is a whole movement of the school and the project of school so that we can push that and search for what we don't have and to know what we have. Because unfortunately, many schools have many resources and us as teachers, we have no access to that because it's somewhere in the corner of a room with no lights, or probably the adapted bathroom has no need to use. And it's there full of material, for example, and we don't even know that the bathroom exists. And not necessarily these are resources come from special education. They may offer accessibility to any student and also to the disabled students. We can't think only about materials or class organization to this audience. We need to think about anti-racism and what is classic when we talk about Brazilian history and talking about the beginning or the characterization of the beginning of the Black population with the slavery. So it is inaccessible because the Black student doesn't feel good to hear this thing, just to hear that. We know that we need to say and give the problematic to the students. We won't deny our history. But this is not the only place that we took in history. So if it is the only place, and many times it becomes the joke class when we talk about slavery, because the look of the majority of the students will be to the Black students. So I break this concept of accessibility because I am taking the possibility of a student because it is Black to be there in the class. And by the way I discuss the content and by the way I show a version of our history.
So we need to think about accessibility in this aspect, where I'm going to talk about people with disability schools in what point of view. So I'm going to be specific, or I'm going to put them as the ones that we always need to help. I bring the video that is going to also keep talking about Black people always in the same way. So I break this this perspective. If I bring different informations, it always has to think accessibility for all of them, for all the groups that are inside school, to know who I'm talking about, not only about this disability, but we have indigenous, we always have Black students, indigenous students. So I need to consider what does not exclude those students from that class, even though it's lack of access to information, but the information that it's excluding those students from the school. So more in a scenario that can be constituted by a Black pupil to lose access to that school. And sometimes it comes to us as one of dropout indicator, as he was he decided to leave and not was excluded. While I was here, he brought important points, especially when we talked about accessibility as a qualifier of education. And of course, that we are thinking about accessibility, inclusion, education, social inclusion. In one school, we're not thinking, obviously, in separate schools. Here is going to be people with disabilities. We're thinking about the school itself and the context that we understand here. And I wanted to have a question. I know that we didn't talk about this, and I want you to explain, when we think about this scenario in the educational field as a place that it's hard for us to think about the practices, the curriculum, the educators. We're thinking about these public policies. What are the actions that you see from your experiences, from your living, the resources, the research that you do? What are the actions in the public policies fields, educational public policies that are being taught to think about as a qualifier of education? I think that I might be going back, asking you to talk once again about accessibility, but I think it's very important for us to qualify, especially in the educational field, as I said in the beginning. So I want you to bring, if you feel comfortable, to bring your perspective about educational public policies, what's being done right now, or what is being taught in this relation concerning this accessibility. I think that it's strange, but as strange as might be, Brazil is one of the countries that invested and created and built collectively legislations of inclusive educations that would favor inside this perspective that we are talking about. So what happens in Brazil is the lack of investment. So public policies, this is something I'm proud of being part of. I'm proud of being part of this movement. It's built by different and several hands. So it's something that it's still fighting, is resisting for years, 40, 30, 20 years, resisting, trying to understand what's happening and trying to guarantee the rights of people with disabilities. But we have a problem here that I think that we won't be able to go towards this inclusive society, that's about the investment itself. For you to understand this dynamic, to have this concept in this inclusive debate, in fact that you need to invest money, because it is not going to be only with people with disability, but it's going to be people with learning difficulties. And the classroom, it's not only teaching one student, one teacher with 40 students. We need to build more schools. And the Black movement keeps, they want them to build more schools and less prisons. That's why I cannot disconnect this movement from the anti-racist movement, because we are asking for the same things, because we understood that this is harming our own people. So this anti-racist movement, it's something that it's an inclusive society, something that does not treat inclusion, does not deal with inclusion in a good way. I work with the inclusive education, and I got reports from teachers saying that God has sent that mission to work with those kids, to work inclusion with those kids. And this is not only about this report, it's something that it is inside our society. And we have legislations that, for example, if we have the inclusive Brazilian law, we are in contact with activists around the world, from India, from some countries in Africa, all over the place. And it's always like this. They always say, you have the legislation, you have the law, you have everything. Why is not working? And what it's missing is this is the lack of investments that it's possible to create this school. That's why I think it's good to work with the SETA project, because maybe it's the first school that in fact is thinking about inclusion in a revolutionary way that that does not exist yet in Brazil. So this is amazing to talk about this in 2022. And I'm a dreamer. And if I can go beyond this, is not only about Brazil, is the whole world and the fight with people in this this fight with this movement, to believe that it's possible to have an accessible society that goes not only through this methodology, but goes through caring and building this accessibility, being a responsibility. Yes, and it's something not only the government responsibility, it's social and collective. And the collective saying, in my head, we're talking about Quilombo, but we are talking about a real inclusive society. And I think that you understand, because we are talking about things that didn't exist until now. I cannot look and say, I would love to come here and say, oh, this project worked, this job worked, but this inclusive education is surrounded by errors. And I keep saying to my friends that it's the people get frustrated with this policy. Is the frustration dynamic. We are going to get it right and wrong, right and wrong. Maybe we'll have a society that will work like this, but we don't know it. But something that I think that I saw it working, we have a important documentary that it's called Creep Camp, that talks about the people with disability in the United States. Of course, understanding the different realities of both countries that are very different. But before they start this fight, this movement, they understand how you get to a camp people with disabilities, with people with high level of people that needed help and people that don't need help, people without disabilities, Black people, because it was like an apartheid. It was during the apartheid, that's why they were in this camp. And automatically you can see this this dynamic happening in a society that thinks about this in a collective way. And this would be amazing. And it's nice for us to see, because you're not only working with these caretakers that are also inside this movement of inclusion of and you transfer this responsibility, that it's not only knowing that life has different bodies, and sometimes I have to help my friend that lives with disability and that's using something that it needs to be changed. So I can give this emotional support, I can give any type of support. And for example, he has a crisis, and when we look at this with people with disabilities, people understand. But when we say, you that don't have any type of disability, are you available to go to a place and help your friend? You think that the teacher wants to help this, for example, a person with disability that needs to wear diapers? Do you think that the teacher would change these diapers? So it should be something inclusive, because a school, it's horizontal. But do you think that when we're thinking about inclusive education, to talk about this inclusive education, in fact, will move this power structures, and then we're going to move this dynamics, and then we're going to move the perception of what in fact is work, to live this, to experience this, to live inside these processes. So personally, I don't believe that we need more legislations. I'm thinking here that it's good to explain that those legislations are so powerful, are so strong, that one of the first governmental attacks that was the is say, let's put people with disabilities for their own space, get them out of the classroom. And why? Because he doesn't like people with disabilities. I can say it's not that he doesn't like people with disabilities. It's because it's not a government that is thinking about inclusion and accessibility. And in the last years, we were getting bolder, the debate was advancing and it was getting good, and then you go back and it's not advancing, because otherwise they will ask for inclusion for Black people. They will ask us to stop killing Black people. They will demand that we guarantee equality and access to all the kids, inclusive bodies that we program to kill it. And we have to change the dynamic of the government and the system as a whole. So I think that the only thing that I'm saying, that legislation, it's great, we have lots of them. The only issue is the investment and responsibility of the processes. When we propose ourselves to have a school that is inclusive, it can be here at SETA Project, or and the normal school, regular school, is not making all the kids to do sing happy birthday to you sign language. This is not inclusion. This is a first contact. It's nice, it's okay, but it's good, but it's not that. Inclusion is, in fact, everyone inside school understanding the collective responsibility of a school and the school community, and bringing down those walls to be part of those spaces. Because when we have a collective way to observe this inclusion, we are able to fight this complex challenges. That it's my thing, that it's my problem. I'm pretty sure that people maybe think that I don't have any type of disability, not because it doesn't exist, that it's here, but it's very complex. Some days I'm good, some days I'm worse. Ingrid, that got used to talk with me, she knows the complex walls that I have and problems, and we need to understand this in a collective way to guarantee this inclusive society.
Thank you, Lu. You gave a very nice and interesting and didactic context to this public policies. I don't know if Ingrid has something to say regarding this point, regarding the legislation, or if we can. Do you want to say something? Go on, Ingrid. I would just like to say that I am fully contemplated by Lu's speech. It's wonderful. If we take the Constitution, all the chapters mention the disabled people, and if we can follow that, we saying, well, inclusion is this, disablement, disable is this. And just to finish, politics and inclusion in general is having everyone taking this place historically there. So thinking about public policies for disabled people is an educational project with a qualifier as accessibility as a principle. So it would be, for example, having Luciana or any disabled people saying not only what are their demands, but saying that they know what they are talking about. And they are the ones to guide us in this discussion. And in this sense, having Luciana here is precisely that, is thinking about some policy to minimally look at these people so that we can, in fact, give accessibility to education. Before we go to the talk to the project, I would like you to detail more about the project and accessibility inside the project, but your speech brought a little bit this concept of intersectionality. I don't know if you can say something regarding that, if you would like to talk about it, because I was thinking about intersectionality in terms of inclusion, gender, race, and class as an analytical tool and social tool to deepen more the social inequality. So in your speech, Ingrid, in one of the first questions, I guess she said about this intersection, about disabilities and race. So I would like you to talk about this concept and what is present in this relation between race and disability.
Posso falar, Ingrid?
Can I start, Ingrid? Well, let's see. We need to understand both concepts first. Capacitism, as Ingrid said, is a concept of an oppression system. It's a domination system. Racism as well. It's also a domination system. So how does it go? It reaches a Black disabled person. Capacitism with white people, and I'll bring that to a more didactic way so that we can understand with the situations, because I think it makes us understand better. So capacitism to white people is he kills, he's violent, he's aggressive. So the person is underestimated at work. When they have some work, they need to be in lower positions, not what they want. Sometimes it's not difficult to see people with post-graduations, masters or doctorates working in lower positions. It's not difficult in this sense. So this is something complicated. And when I'm talking about lower positions, I'm talking about, like, for example, working in a supermarket, but he has a Down syndrome. Well, this is a reality of people, disabled people entering the job market. Many times Black people have difficulties to enter the job market because they know they will be judged, because it doesn't matter having the law if we can understand the imaginary of the people hiring these people. So when we talk about disabled people and Black disabled people, there is some history behind that, and it's erased. So where were the slaves that were disabled? We have no data about it. We have no data about police violence they suffer to be disabled. We have no data about it. We have no data about what kind of violence Black disabled people suffer. No data about it. When you are Black, and this is so strong that when you are Black, like my case, and this disability is not apparent, there is an under notification and lack of access to diagnose. So we are not talking about access to health care system. We are talking about lack of diagnosis. There is some difficulties in the healthcare system, but when we access it, whether public or private, the diagnosis is you are Black. The diagnosis is you are Black, you have anger issues, people like you is like this, and so on. And we can understand that there are many cases of physical disability and people who wouldn't work anymore because they are disabled, and that's it. Like, for example, a motorcycle accident. And then this person spent 7 years being diagnosed that it would be a temporary disability. They would work again one day, and being neglected by this model and this system. So this is the first point. And I think we should understand these dynamics of how disabled people historically are being erased, and they go to a marginalized place. They go to the limb. We are marginalized all the time because it's not that race comes first, but it's race plus disability, and it goes to marginalization. And then we have even prepared, and I'll just mention here because I think it's important, a quote that is quite nice, that I fell in love with this quote. I will always repeat that. I generally say that it was a friend of mine who said that, but this author, Falanin, he says that he is from the social model of disability, and he writes, before we question the medical model, or before Black people had no access to health. And I wrote a book called Alienation in Psychiatry, talking about some psychiatric writings. I mean, he doesn't write as a psychiatrist. There is no perspective in this sense in the book, but when he is in this position, it's very nice because he observed many years ago what we observe now. And then I have a friend who says that psychiatrists found out this phenomenon in 2020. So it took a long time for that. But finally, we found that out and we can debate. But anyway, his quote is, the normal person is the one who doesn't create any difficulties. But then the union people who protest are normals. What are the normality criteria? When he talks about the person that doesn't create difficulties, he's talking about white people as well. So a white person who doesn't create any kind of difficulty, maybe a disabled person, and a Black person, when they have a disability, a limitation, and they have to deal with the barriers they face in society, that is the person creating the difficulty. And how to treat that, how society understands that. It can be anything else besides disability. So you take from the Black people the identity of being disabled. So intersectionality is there when we, in fact, is more marginalized, facing the stigmas, because we need some access or certain understanding that the majority of people don't have. Another obvious example is that in my history, first, I was self-diagnosed as autist via my kid because I heard a justification of the doctor that I was not autist because I was married. So it makes no sense. So you are married, you have no autism. So it's not a matter of neurology. So first I had to understand the process to search for other professional. Okay, so I understood. I took a neuropsychological assessment. And when I did that, what did I understand? One of the criteria in this evaluation, and look how we need to think about the social context, the psychosocial context of people. Because when I took this test, this assessment, one of the questions that is a diagnosis criteria for autism is, do you identify the intention of the person by their physiognomy? This is an important criteria to identify autists. And I promptly said, well, I identify when it's racism, but other things I can't, like irony or other social pacts, I can't understand. If I am facing a professional that doesn't have intersectionality and doesn't have it in the evaluation, and even this term is in my diagnosis, this professional says, well, you are not autist. If you identify racism, you are not autist. But As I was facing a professional thinking about that and who understands why Black autist people have barriers as ways of surviving to this extremely racist and capacitive society. So he said, it's not a determining factor to define if you are autist or not. It is a factor to indicate a problematic issue of society. You shouldn't have contact with the physiognomies and speeches or anything racist, but it is there and it breaks you when you created a way to stop that. So look how intersectionality is not only an academic and social concept, it needs to go through all the fields. I gave an example of a doctor, but I could give an example of a teacher, a professor. I am a Black girl with a disability, autism, and I was neglected and elected by a teacher as the dumbest, the stupidest, this is the term, in the classroom for many years. And why? Because the teacher couldn't accept a white girl questioning him.
So if we disconnect intersectionality from this debate in a universal way, we isolate this debate, and then women is going to be about white women, capability is going to be about white people, racism will be about Black people that will be in the margin, LGBT phobia will be about white LGBT people, and race will be exclusion criteria. To me, this capability, it's going to guide us, and also race. So it's a Black person, it's not only Black, he's a woman, he's LGBT, and he can be someone with disability. This is what we understand as intersectionality. You brought a whole new perspective that is very interesting to think about intersectionality, about this context that you're talking about. Ingrid, if you want to say something, please. Well, I have been working with Luciana. I keep learning with her and thinking about this intersectionality, race, people with disability, and having this access to education. If we take the number of places for people with disabilities, most of them are not Black people. Most of these openings, and not that they don't have the right for this openings. If we get most people that were able to try these positions, these openings that enter university, Black people are not, most of them or none of them are not with people with disability. If we do not consider both aspects, will make it impossible the access of Black people with disabilities in the space. If they use the quota system, they are Black and they have disabilities, they have less chances. And going for the quota, if they use only the color quota, they have less chances. If they use only the disability quota, they have less chances. So we need something that is going to be specific for Black people with disability, because we understand that if you are not reading this intersectionality, that Black people have disabilities different from what they are searching to get in through university. If they don't consider both things, they are going to be left behind. So we cannot think about inclusion without talking about intersectionality. We also will leave someone behind. So as a special educator, it is not that when we came back to the activities where I was working, the school I was working, only one Black people with disability didn't came back because he couldn't access, he was not able to follow the year in the first contact they told us. And so I think that we need investment. So someone with the disability inside the school, if we don't have, if they are not Black, it's a different investment. The investment that the school is doing with someone with disability and is Black, it's different, even though they don't understand that. This does not take the school responsibility, but I'm saying that we always need to look at people with disability and consider their color, their condition. In the research sector, in the special education, it's so recent. It's pretty recent. It's 5 years from now, and as we start seeing that people with disability are start appearing with race or color. People with disability are excluded from school. They are excluded from from work, they're from sports. You don't know their colors. It seems that they are only disabled. They don't have any other thing. When we start looking at the gender, and then it comes from 20 years ago, they started saying that people with disability and they're women, people with disability, men, and now recently, what's the color of those people? And then we are able, in fact, to identify where the places these people are not occupying, because this is what we are talking about. And also we have this mission to change the public policy when we have these statistics. It's not PNAD and PNAD COVID, we don't know by PNAD and PNAD COVID, this ongoing research, who are people with disability. The statistic data that we have are the one from IBGE from 2010. So it needs to be updated. So even though they need to be updated, those are data that thinking about people with the intellectual disability, most of them Black men, Black boys and Black men are people who don't have the study, they don't have the money, they have the worst health condition, they don't have their best houses. So this data, when separated by disability, they are not being treated by public policies and are not being treated by the institutions that produce this data. For us to get to these results, who are the people with disability considering color and what they are living, we need to domain a certain tool that it's not a public it's not accessible for the main audience. You need to train, you need to use the tool so you're able to download those data in a way to separate and start this debate. So to allow this accessibility and to understand what are those people conditions and the place they live, we need to consider their condition, their color, and other marks. If we don't analyze this intersectionally, Black people will be left behind, people with disabilities will be left behind, and we will not guarantee this perspective. Otherwise, this accessibility, since the production of data and also what it's going, and also using this data to have new information. So I think that this is fundamental for any type of debate that we have. If we want to look at Black people, if you want to look at people with disability.
Caramba.
I'm here thinking, I'm sad that we don't have enough time, but I will ask something. No, it's not a question. I want you to consider everything that we talked about and getting this intersectionality. I would like to talk a little bit about the project. So how are you thinking, how the project is thinking about this construction, considering the proposals, the activities, the accessibility concept, on how the project, SETA project, will guarantee that, in fact, it's going to be accessible in an anti-racist context, and it's going to be inclusive. We are thinking about accessibility as one of the main pillars of the project, at the same importance that we have with races, that race has in building this collective accessibility, making accessible. This is one of the it's one of the difficulties that we had that goes beyond this concept of accessibility. But this understanding on how we'll get this school, as I said before, how we will get this revolution in the educational system that is going to become accessible. It's a model, and how we will transform this. This is the main challenge that we are having. And we have to work with accessibility throughout the spaces beyond this conversation to be able to get a class that will work with this reading of an article, of a test, or transform this in an accessible class. How can we do that? Do we request this description that will record the reading and everyone will listen, or maybe we can bring to the simple language that is going to have people with disability and also people that have any learning disability. So it's going to work as an alternative. How does how accessibility it's going to be possible for everyone through this alternative. We have to disconnect this communication, this normative communication idea that we established. Communication is the one who is speaking. Is that right? We don't know. We have to understand. So this is one of the dynamics and one of the challenges, because obviously we are bringing here historical and theoretical concepts, but we need to understand inside this process that not everybody have all the answers, and this is important. And I think that this is what stays from a project like that I truly believe, and that's why I'm part of it. So I will try to, we have to understand that sometimes we will work with this frustration, we will give up, and sometimes it might work, and if it doesn't work, it's okay, but we won't give up. We will continue, because this is education. This should be education. The education should go through by the, we cannot give up, we cannot forgive or want to give up of this learning process only because we cannot handle, or maybe because we think that we won't be able to learn. And this is important. I think that a sentence that is important for us to have as a goal in our project, and is, I think that this is what we are building here, is that everyone learn. Everyone learn. Oh, but they have cognitive disability, they learn. Oh, but he's autistic, he learns. Oh, but he has this or that, he will learn, he or she will learn. Everyone is capable of learning, and not only learning, teaching. I think that when we work that, we are working this concept of accessibility inside the project. Well, I see SETA as a project of resistance. I think that it goes through many types of oppression that the Black populations has to go through for different reasons. And being a resistance, thinking about our consultant work, what I see as a potential it's the qualifier. So things that might seem simple, but when we look at when we put them throughout, when we put the word accessible, we are saying that accessibility is still not the the rule. So when we put in all the projects that it's for Black people, for Indigenous people, we have this concern with the Quilombola population, and we are saying that we should include people with disabilities, because we are saying, yeah, people with disabilities exist, they can be part of this, they learn, but we need to talk about them. If we don't talk about them, they are going to be erased. Even for us that are this everything that happens concerning trying to guarantee accessibility is a risk, because it's not the rule in the daily basis. We have to keep turning our mind and say, I'm talking about this accessibility, but what's my behavior? I'm talking about skills, but what's my point of view? What are the technologies that I'm using in my daily basis? So I think that this qualification, this inside the project is revolutionary. It's extremely revolutionary. I don't know other projects that have this that work with these different forms of oppression, and highlighting this the places where people with disabilities as a territory, not just a small space for those who want to get someone if they going to need this accessibility, or someone that is going to need something that demands us to think about accessibility. We inside the project, those who are going to use our challenges and our intention with our part here is keep marking this, that we are talking about these activities, we are talking about accessibility. I'm not thinking about the students. We are setting some boundaries. We are talking about this, and if it's part of the project, we might have teachers with disabilities. So we need to delimitate this with accessibility. And inside SETA Project, we try to talk about this from inside out and since the beginning. So it's something that it's going to be having accessibility as a principle, but not as only as a written principle, but inside its construction, because we are part of this roundtable, even though to talk about accessibility, even though right now we don't have the opportunity to throw this idea through all the spaces and territories, but inside the project construction. And since the beginning, we are able to see this. The project is it's open-minded since the first time that we think, well, let's talk about accessibility, let's talk about capability, and it's fundamental that we have someone with disabilities. And
so it may seem silly, but this indication was never questioned. I mean, who disabled person? Do we have qualification for that? And this question has never happened at SETA Project. So I think this relation regarding the concept of accessibility and people who can benefit from this perspective and this principle of the project will be revolutionary. And I truly believe it will be an example to other projects that may come, as Lou said, that are rights and wrongs, but education is where education go through. I mean, attempts and understanding where we are right, so not to forget, so that we don't have to redesign all that and not reworking and give an opportunity to think. And I think that's it we have in the project. And to me, this is it. Well, I can ensure as part of this group that we are learning a lot, and that it's quite challenging, but it's quite motivating as well. We are very happy to have you two as consultant of the project. We learn a lot, and we truly believe the project has its legacy. We have just a few minutes before the end, so I'll ask you to have your final considerations. to check what we haven't said, what you want to point out in this sense. And if you want to suggest some reading, we have teachers, educators, professors that may watch this discussion and may be here watching that. So if you have any suggestions for of books or anything to start that, I mean, to strengthen this debate that is so important on accessibility and everything that you brought regarding social inclusion and so on. So the floor is yours. Well, I will follow what I've been doing so far and ask people to hear. I mean, it's not wrong to study about disabilities. I think that I am able to do that, but I think we have to hear researchers, players, actors, actresses, influencers, productions, visual producers, and all that of disabled people being the protagonists. One of the books that I truly like and I would suggest is, I mean, it's not a book, it's a documentary that I think it's interesting because it thinks about inclusive education as a whole. So it is one place to fits all. This is a documentary bringing inclusive education. It's from Institute Alana, bringing the disabled people in the center of decisions of where to study, where's the best place to me so that I can study and have my autonomy. And another thing of thinking inclusion with affection is something that I like a lot. I like to talk about it because inclusion is being affected, is having affection to the other beyond the public policies. And this is a relation. I mean, we are missing relations and we only think about relations and affecting, as Ingrid mentioned, because sometimes even us studying on what is inserted in the menu, we can forget to include that because we have no experience with disabled people. So hearing the many people, and I won't say that you are all right. I'm saying about hearing many speeches of disabled people telling their experience, Black disabled people, white disabled people, people with physical or cognitive disabilities or sensorial disabilities. So please hear disabled people. I think it is halfway through to think about inclusion. For example, if you have a friend in a wheelchair, you won't go to a restaurant if there is no accessibility. If you have an autistic person in your family, and if you have any kind of relation with the person, you think about it because you only go to a restaurant with people you relate to. So if you have relations with disabilities by affection, you'll be offended as if it's directly to you. Then this is the way we start to understand and think about the teacher and the role they have in this process that is mandatory with affection. But the look of the teacher is the look of a study, an object, and how to break the barriers of the disabled person and how I teach this disabled kid when in fact the question should be, how can I provide teaching? How can I ensure that I teach and the kid learn in this process? Not only the disabled person, but all kids going through this process. This is important in the dynamics of this process to understand. So my suggestion is these two documentaries, book, What is the Disability from Deborah Diniz. It's wonderful. And Claudia Werneck's book, Nobody Will Be Nice in Inclusive Society, that I think is one of the books that moved me the most to fight for rights, not only mine, but my kids and everyone's that couldn't fight and are just surviving and literally can't fight for their own rights and the rights of collectivity. I think that's it. And I would like to thank a lot. Thank you for this event. Thank you for the invitation and for the talk. I am learning a lot here as well. It's always nice to talk to Ingrid. I think this is, she is the systematic part of this big mess of inclusion that I have in my mind. And I'm very thankful to be in the project and being with Ingrid during this time. I won't abandon her. So if you think the project is over and I will abandon you, no, this is a real present to be part of that in such a deep and intense way in the construction of a project that, to my perception and to me, is one of the most revolutionary projects of education we had in the country. Well, first of all, I didn't organize anything by myself. We organized together a way of working and thinking about the big collectivity, you and me. We complement, and I don't want to give this idea that the disabled person will only need someone to mediate or organize. Nothing that. So it's fantastic and it brings a lot. And I think thinking about the suggestions, I share Lu's perspective, that is hearing disabled people, reading disabled people, so that we can break the stigmas of what is having a disability. And based on this new reading, so that we can constitute, we'll then search for other ways. So understanding the disabled person as the one in need of help make us choose search for accessibility via one side, but understanding the human diversities makes us search diversity in a totally different way. So the first movement and my first suggestion is this, is to reinforce the contact and to read and to follow in social networks. It's quite transforming to education. I like to say, when I am in groups with the teachers, about a term that historically is marked in school, that is saying my inclusion student. When instituted in Brazil, mainly with the inclusive law, this perspective for education of disabled kids, this terminology worked, and it's difficult to break that now. And I call your attention because whenever we say my inclusion student, we are saying inclusion, but we are presupposing exclusion. If we say they need to be included, I'm not saying that the others are excluded, because sometimes there is this dichotomy. So if there is an inclusion, who would be the exclusion? But I use inclusion to talk about their students' exclusion. So when I say inclusion student, I am excluding the student, because I'm not saying one more student. I am marking the student from one point of view that might not be a stigma, but I am dehumanizing my student who can't read or can't learn due to an intellectual disability. So we need to talk about the subject by their names. I mean, in school, this terminology is quite challenging, because sometimes we have know what to say about a group. So this is an important movement for accessibility, because I'm not a disabled person, but I heard from many that it's very discomfortable to hear that the inclusion student, I am the inclusion student in my classroom. So there is a whole movement that is not by me, but by the whole school and society, because thinking about inclusion is thinking about education first, and being able to deal with education and qualifying less. So I suggest a documentary called The Estimated Autists. They are adult autists diagnosed later. And there are Black and white people in this documentary, so we can see the differentiation of the process as well due to race and color. So this is my suggestion. And lastly, I think a lot. I am very thankful to be in the project, to share my daily life with Lu and have our talks in the project, because we do that every day via WhatsApp all the time. And It's very nice to be part of this history and learn with that. Because the time we take here with reading, this is a place of collective construction. So I'm very thankful for the opportunity you gave me. So I'll take that for my life. Wow, we are the ones to thank you. Thank you, Ingrid. Thank you, Luciana, for your discussions and reflections and debates on anti-racist education, inclusion, accessibility. So everything is very important to strengthen and disseminate and spread this agenda of education. Once again, I thank our sign language interpreters, the people following us here. I'll mention a Urubá quote that says, "One single tree is not a forest." So to me, this says a lot about this project, SETA Project. It is an innovative alliance with the 7 organizations of the civil society, national and international, ActionAid, Ação Educativa, Campanha Nacional pelos Direitos à Educação, Coordenação Nacional de Articulação das Comunidades Negras, Rurais, Quilombolas, CONAQ, Geledés, Instituto da Mulher Negra, Makira E'ta, and Uneafro Brazil. SETA is one of the finalists of Kellogg Foundation to promote gender equity. Follow us on Instagram at SETA Project and website projetoseta.org.br. That's it. See you soon.